Forget everything you thought you knew about where and how the British Empire fought its wars. We're about to uncover a hidden chapter, a saga of audacious raids, engineering marvels, and unsung heroes battling heat, disease, and a formidable enemy in the vast, unforgiving deserts of the Ottoman Empire. Get ready to witness a side of the Redcoats you've never seen. When the popular imagination turns to the British Army of the 18th and 19th centuries, it invariably conjures images of rain-slicked fields in Flanders, the rolling green hills of the Iberian Peninsula, or perhaps the humid jungles of India. We picture the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, or the thin red lines standing firm against a backdrop of European forestry. Yet there exists a parallel history, bleached by the sun and buried under drifting sands, where the distinct scarlet of the British uniform stood in stark, blinding contrast to the beige dunes of the Middle East. This narrative does not begin with the trench warfare of Gallipoli or the romanticized guerrilla campaigns of Lawrence of Arabia in the First World War. Long before the 20th century dawned, the British soldier was already well acquainted with the Ottoman desert. This is the story of two pivotal, yet strangely overlooked campaigns in Egypt that effectively bookended the 19th century: the expedition of 1801 and the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. These conflicts represent the alpha and omega of the classic redcoat in the desert. They tell the story of an army evolving from the rigid formations of the Napoleonic Wars to the dawn of modern imperial policing, all while struggling to adapt to an environment that wanted them dead. In 1801, the strategic calculus was driven by one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. His invasion of Egypt was a direct dagger aimed at the throat of the British Empire, the route to India. The British response was not merely a diplomatic protest, but a massive amphibious projection of power. Under the command of Sir Ralph Abercrombie, thousands of men were deployed to the Nile Delta. These were men equipped for the cool climates of Northern Europe, now asked to march and fight in heavy wool tunics and stifling leather shakos under the North African sun. They faced not only the veteran legions of the French Republic, but the sheer alien nature of the terrain itself. Fast forward 80 years to 1882, and the geopolitical landscape had shifted, yet the fundamental challenge remained the same. The Suez Canal had been cut through the sand, becoming the new jugular vein of the British Empire. When the Urabi Revolt threatened to sever this lifeline, the British Army returned. By this time, the weapons had evolved. Breech-loading rifles and Gatling guns had replaced muskets. But the soldiers' burden had hardly lightened. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, the British infantry conducted the last major battle in history fought in the traditional scarlet coat. It was the final curtain call for the old-world aesthetic of war, played out on a stage of sand and stone. Why have these campaigns faded from the collective memory? Perhaps because they sit awkwardly between the glorious decisive victories of the Napoleonic era and the industrial slaughter of the world wars. They were wars of logistics, of endurance, and of uncomfortable imperial expansion rather than existential defense. Yet, their strategic importance cannot be overstated. These operations prove that Britain could project substantial military power outside the comfortable logistics of Europe. They demonstrated that an island nation could deposit an army on a hostile, arid coast and sustain it. However, the cost of this projection was immense. To the soldiers on the ground, high-level strategy meant little compared to the daily reality of their environment. This was a theatre of war where the sun was a weapon as lethal as any cannon. There was no cover, no fresh water, and no respite. As we delve deeper into this forgotten front, we will see that the greatest enemy the Redcoats faced was often not the French infantry or the Egyptian gunners, but the desert itself. It required a complete reimagining of how an army lived, moved, and fought. Before a single shot could be fired in anger, the British Army had to win a war against thirst, blindness, and the crushing weight of their own equipment. If the popular saying holds that an army marches on its stomach, then an army in the Ottoman desert survives entirely on its throat. For the British commanders planning these expeditions, the tactical map was secondary to the hydrological one. The first and most terrifying reality for the Redcoats landing on foreign shores was not the enemy line, but the desperate, all-consuming absence of water. In the 1801 campaign, this crisis manifested the moment the boots hit the sand at Aboukir Bay. Sir Ralph Abercrombie's force had managed to secure a beachhead, but the victory was precarious. The French army, commanded by Napoleon's successors, controlled the interior and, crucially, the Nile. The British were pinned against the sea, occupying a barren stretch of dunes where the sun beat down with relentless ferocity. The fleet could provide only limited supplies, and the logistical tether back to the ships was fragile. Desperation drove innovation. Soldiers, parched and weary from the landing, were ordered to dig. Thousands of men fell to their knees, scraping away the loose earth of the beach, creating makeshift wells in the hope of tapping into the water table. What they found was a brackish, muddy liquid, barely potable, tasting of salt and grit, but it was enough to sustain life. It was a stark introduction to the region. The Grand Imperial Army was reduced to scratching at the earth like marooned sailors, fighting a battle for hydration that had to be won every single hour of the day. But the desert held threats more insidious than thirst. As the campaign dragged on, a silent enemy began to stalk the ranks, one that no amount of musketry could repel. It arrived on the wings of millions of flies that swarmed the encampments, turning redcoats black with their sheer numbers. They brought with them Egyptian ophthalmia, a virulent form of trachoma. The accounts from the time are harrowing. Men would wake with their eyelids glued shut, the inflammation rapidly progressing to excruciating pain, and for many, permanent blindness. It tore through the regiments with the speed of a plague. Entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective, not by French grapeshot, but by a microscopic bacterium. The medical corps was overwhelmed. Hospital became halls of darkness, where hundreds of men sat in terrified isolation, their sight stolen by the very environment they had come to conquer. This medical disaster was so profound, it would eventually force a complete overhaul of British military hygiene and medical practices back home. A grim legacy of the cost of empire. 80 years later, during the 1882 campaign, the British Army brought the might of the Industrial Revolution to Egypt, yet the fundamental vulnerability remained. Sir Garnet Wolseley's strategy to suppress the Arabi revolt hinged entirely on the control of the Sweetwater Canal, a man-made artery flowing from the Nile to Ismailia. The Egyptian forces, well aware of this dependence, threatened to dam the canal or, worse, poison it with rotting carcasses. The anxiety in the British camp was palpable. The water level in the canal began to drop, turning into a sluggish, foul-smelling sludge. Engineers worked feverishly to build filtration systems, but the spectre of dehydration hung over every tactical decision. To compound the misery, the 1882 expedition faced a heatwave that defied European comprehension. The soldiers were still fighting in wool, heavy, suffocating serge tunics, designed for Canadian winters or drizzly parades in London. Heatstroke became a more prolific killer than the enemy. In the days leading up to the main assault, field hospitals were filled not with the wounded, but with men collapsed from thermal exhaustion, their bodies shutting down under the sun's fire. To keep the army from stalling in the sand, the British turned to a new breed of soldier, the engineer. If 1801 was a war of bayonets, 1882 was a war of logistics. The campaign saw the innovative use of a dedicated railway corps. These men were tasked with repairing the train lines sabotaged by retreating Egyptian forces. Under the constant threat of sniper fire and cavalry raids, engineers laid tracks and repaired locomotives, driving the iron horse through the desert. This was a logistical marvel. For the first time, water, ammunition, and food could be rushed from the Suez Canal to the front lines by steam power. The image of a steam locomotive chugging through the ancient sands, carrying crates of Martini Henry ammunition and tanks of distilled water, symbolized the clash of eras. It was this mechanical lifeline that allowed Wolseley to mass his forces deep in the desert, overcoming the logistical nightmare that had nearly destroyed Abercrombie's army a century prior. The Redcoats had learned that to defeat the Ottomans, they first had to tame the logistics of the wasteland. Having survived the agonizing thirst and the ravages of disease, the British army still faced the task they had actually come to perform: fighting. But combat in the Ottoman desert bore little resemblance to the wars of Europe. In Flanders or Spain, armies maneuvered around rivers, forests, and towns, using the terrain to anchor their flanks. Here, the terrain was a void. The desert offered no cover, no high ground, and nowhere to hide. It was a tactical blank slate, exposed entirely to the sun and the enemy's sightlines. To win, British commanders had to discard the rigid dogmas of the drill book and innovate under fire. The sheer audacity of these adaptations was first displayed on the shores of Aboukir Bay in 1801. The amphibious landing is often cited as one of the most complex military maneuvers, and Sir Ralph Abercrombie's execution of it remains a masterclass in discipline. As the British fleet lowered its boats, the French defenders waiting on the dunes above held every advantage. They had positioned artillery to sweep the water and lined the crests with musketeers. The British troops, packed tightly into open rowboats, had to endure a slow, agonizing approach under a storm of cannonballs and grape shot. There was no return fire. The soldiers simply sat, gripping their muskets, watching the water erupt around them. When the keels finally scraped the sand, the chaos should have been total. Instead, the Redcoats displayed a coolness that stunned the French observers. They leaped into the surf, waist-deep in water, and amidst the crashing waves and whizzing lead, they did not run for cover. They formed their lines. Before they even reached dry land, the distinct red rows were assembled. With a discipline forged in drill yards thousands of miles away, they fixed bayonets and charged straight up the shifting sand dunes, driving the French back by sheer cohesive force. Once established ashore, the infantry faced a new terror: the Mamluk and Ottoman cavalry. These horsemen were legendary for their speed and ferocity, and the open desert was their ideal hunting ground. In response, the British relied on the infantry square. It was a formation as old as the pike, but in the emptiness of the desert, it became a mobile fortress. A single battalion could transform into a hollow box of bristling bayonets, impervious to cavalry charges from any direction. The Desert War proved that while the environment was alien, the geometry of European warfare, when applied with iron nerve, could still dominate the sands. By 1882, however, the tactical equation had changed. The enemy was no longer charging with scimitars. The Egyptian army under Ahmed Urabi was modernized, equipped with Krupp artillery and breech-loading rifles, entrenched behind formidable earthworks at Tel el-Kebir. The approach to their position was a long, flat plain of gravel and sand, a perfect killing ground, offering zero cover. To attack across it in daylight, under the blazing sun and against modern firepower, would have been suicide. General Garnet Wolseley, the commander of the British expedition, devised a plan that was as risky as it was brilliant. He would negate the sun and the enemy's sights by attacking the desert itself. He ordered a night march. This was unheard of for a force of this size. 13,000 men moving across featureless terrain in pitch darkness. The operation required a terrifying level of discipline. As night fell, the order went down the lines. Absolute silence. No smoking, no talking, and secure all equipment so nothing would clatter. The army became a ghost. Guidance was provided not by maps, which were useless in the dark dunes, but by the stars, with naval officers from the Royal Navy leading the columns like ships at sea. For hours, the massive force shuffled through the sand, the sound of thousands of boots muffled by the soft desert floor. The tension was excruciating. A single accidental gunshot or a shout could alert the Egyptian sentries and turn the march into a massacre. Just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the silhouette of the Egyptian earthworks appeared, looming directly ahead. The British were mere hundreds of yards away, undetected. The silence was finally broken not by a command, but by the sudden eruption of the Egyptian lines as the sentries spotted the red wall emerging from the gloom. It was too late for the defenders. The Highland Brigade, the Black Watch, the Gordon Highlanders, and the Cameron Highlanders did not stop to fire. They unleashed a wild cheer that shattered the morning stillness and charged with cold steel. In 20 frenzied minutes, they stormed the parapets, overwhelmed the gun crews, and broke the Egyptian army. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir was over almost as soon as the sun had fully risen. Wolseley had used the desert night to defeat the desert heat, proving that the Redcoats could adapt their tactics to master even the most hostile environments on Earth. While generals like Wolseley and Abercrombie moved flags on maps, the reality of the Desert War was born on the cracked shoulders of the private soldier. Victory in the Ottoman domains is often measured by history in terms of miles secured or treaties signed, but the true cost was tallied in the tattered journals and letters home, written by men pushed to the very brink of human endurance. To read the personal accounts of the 1801 and 1882 campaigns is to step into a world of sensory extremity. Diaries from the time do not speak of glory. They speak of a burning sand that radiated heat through the thickest boot soles, blistering feet until marching became an act of torture. They describe a silence so profound in the deep desert that it was psychologically unnerving, broken only by the wind hissing over the dunes, a sound that many soldiers claimed drove men to madness. The psychological toll of the emptiness was immense. Far from the green fields of home, surrounded by a landscape that looked like the surface of a dead planet, soldiers grappled with a profound sense of isolation. The physical reality was equally brutal. The redcoat uniform, an icon of imperial power, was a torment in this theatre. In 1801, men fought in tight stocks and heavy wool that trapped sweat and sand against the skin, causing raw, infected sores. By 1882, despite some adaptations, the misery persisted. Water was rationed to the drop, and men would recount the agony of watching mirages shimmer on the horizon, promising relief that never came. The fear of being left behind was palpable. To fall out of the line of march in the desert was effectively a death sentence, guaranteeing a lonely end by exposure or at the hands of hostile local tribesmen. Yet, who were these men enduring the unendurable? The British force was far from a monolith of English yeomanry. These campaigns highlighted the diverse, multi-ethnic engine of the British Empire. The Highland regiments, the Black Watch, the Gordons, the Camerons, occupied a special place in the narrative. Their kilts, seemingly the most impractical garment for desert warfare, became a symbol of defiance. At Tel el-Kebir, it was the ladies from hell, as they were later nicknamed, whose distinct silhouette struck terror into the defenders. But the sun spared no one. The backs of their knees were often burned raw, a painful price for their regimental pride. Crucially, the desert campaigns relied heavily on the muscle and bravery of the British Indian Army. Long before the Western Front of the First World War, Indian sepoys were essential to British force projection in the Middle East. Regiments arrived via the Red Sea, bringing men who were often better acclimatized to the heat, but no less vulnerable to the disease and privation of the campaign. The sight of turbans serving alongside pith helmets and Glengarries illustrated a pivotal shift. The empire was defending its interests with a global army. These Indian soldiers fought with distinction, securing vital supply lines and participating in the fiercest skirmishes. Yet their stories have largely slipped through the cracks of the dominant historical narrative. The legacy of these campaigns was branded onto the soldiers who survived them. Those who returned to Britain brought back more than just tales of pyramids and pashas. They carried the Egypt battle honour, a distinction so unique that it allowed regiments to bear the badge of the Sphinx on their colours and cap badges, a symbol still worn by British regiments today. But they also brought back a hardened, stoic resilience. The Tommy of the late Victorian era, capable of grumbling his way through the worst conditions imaginable without breaking, was forged in the fires of the Egyptian desert. This was a new kind of soldier, one who had looked into the blinding sun of the Ottoman Empire, endured the impossible, and held the line. As the dust settled on the trenches of Tel el-Kebir, and the last of the wounded were ferried down the Nile, a strange silence fell over the diplomatic corridors of Europe. The British Army had achieved a dazzling tactical success. In a matter of weeks, Wolseley had dismantled the Egyptian military, suppressed the Arabi revolt, and secured the safety of the Khedive. According to the politicians in London, particularly the Prime Minister William Gladstone, the mission was now accomplished. The Redcoats had come to restore order, not to conquer. The plan was to pack up, board the ships, and sail home, leaving a stable Egypt behind them. But history rarely adheres to political promises. The victory in 1882 triggered a geopolitical landslide that would trap the British in the desert for the next 70 years. Instead of leaving, the British Army dug in. They had inadvertently stumbled into what historians would later call the Veiled Protectorate. Egypt remained technically a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Khedive remained its nominal ruler, but the true power now resided in the hands of the British Consul General and the bayonets of the British garrison. This shift was driven by a single, overwhelming strategic obsession: the Suez Canal. Before the 1882 campaign, the canal was viewed primarily as a commercial convenience, a French-built ditch that shaved weeks off the journey to Bombay. But after seeing how easily a revolt could threaten this artery, the British military establishment came to a terrifying realization. The canal was the jugular vein of the empire. If it was cut, the connection to India, Australia, and New Zealand would be severed. Protection of the canal transformed from a corporate interest into an existential necessity for imperial survival. Consequently, Egypt ceased to be a foreign country in the eyes of the War Office and became the swing door of the empire. The desert camps that had been makeshift logistical nightmares in 1801 and 1882 were solidified into permanent bases. Alexandria and Cairo were transformed into massive military hubs, housing the barracks, hospitals, and supply depots that would service the empire's needs in the east. The Redcoats, who had struggled to find water in the sand dunes, began to build the infrastructure of a permanent occupation. This transformation was not merely about bricks and mortar. It fundamentally altered the British military psyche. The army that had once looked almost exclusively to the defence of the British Isles or the policing of India now had a third centre of gravity. The Middle East became a primary theatre of operations. Officers who would later command armies in the Great War cut their teeth patrolling the borders of the Nile, learning the intricacies of desert diplomacy and tribal politics. The temporary occupation had hardened into an imperial fixture. The British presence in Egypt effectively partitioned the Ottoman Empire long before the treaties of World War I were even drafted. It signalled to the other great powers, France, Germany, and Russia, that the Eastern Mediterranean was now a British lake. This move sowed the seeds of future conflict, creating a friction point that would grind away at diplomatic relations for decades. For the soldiers on the ground, the Veiled Protectorate meant that the desert was no longer just a place to raid, it was a place to live. The British soldier became a fixture of Egyptian life, patrolling the bazaars of Cairo and guarding the banks of the Sweetwater Canal. The exoticism of the 1801 expedition gave way to the routine of colonial garrison duty. Yet this strategic anchor was heavy. By seizing Egypt, Britain had taken responsibility for its borders, including the vast, lawless expanses of the Sudan to the south. The victory at Tel el-Kebir had solved one problem, but created a dozen others, drawing the empire deeper into the complex, volatile politics of the region. A commitment that would demand blood and treasure long after the last scarlet tunic had faded from the sun. The strategic anchor dropped in 1882 did not merely hold the empire steady. It became the fulcrum upon which the entire modern Middle East would be leveraged. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the military infrastructure built by Wolseley's engineers, the railways, the water pipelines, the garrison towns, ceased to be tools of occupation and became the launchpad for the Great War. When the Ottoman Empire finally sided with Germany in 1914, the value of the forgotten campaigns became violently apparent. Britain did not have to scramble to find a foothold in the region. They were already there, entrenched and waiting. The Egypt expeditions had gifted the Allies a fortress at the crossroads of the world. It was from these very bases, established by the Redcoats decades earlier, that General Edmund Allenby would launch his sweep into Palestine and Syria, driving the final nail into the coffin of Ottoman power. This military reality directly informed the geopolitical reshaping of the region. Enter Sir Mark Sykes, the British diplomat whose name would become synonymous with the controversial borders of the modern Middle East. When Sykes sat down with his French counterpart, François-Georges Picot, to carve up the Ottoman cadaver in the secret agreement of 1916, he was not looking at a blank map. He was looking at a map already coloured red at the bottom. The British claim to influence over Palestine, Jordan and Iraq was not based on abstract historical rights, but on the tangible reality that the British Army, supplied from its massive base in Egypt, was the only force capable of physically holding the territory. The shadow of Tel el-Kebir lay long over the negotiating table. Without that decisive victory in 1882, Britain would have had no chips with which to bargain. Furthermore, the tactical lessons learned in the Victorian dust would echo through the decades, evolving into a distinct British doctrine of desert warfare. The innovative use of railways and specialised supply corps in 1882 was the grandfather of the mechanised logistics that would define World War II. When Montgomery fought Rommel at El Alamein in the 1940s, his tanks rolled over the same gravel plains that Wolseley's infantry had marched across by starlight. The enemy had changed from pashas to panzers, and the transport from horses to trucks. But the fundamental rules of the game, the obsession with supply lines, the dominance of the flanks, the tyranny of water, remained exactly as the Redcoats had discovered them. Even the spirit of the desert soldier persisted. The desert rat ethos, characterized by a certain rugged informality and a distinct separation from the stiff discipline of the home front, can trace its lineage back to the dusty, fly-blown camps of the 19th century. It was here that the British Army learned that to survive in the wilderness, one had to dispense with the superfluous. The rigid adherence to regulations that worked in Chelsea barracks melted away under the Egyptian sun, replaced by a pragmatic professionalism that prioritized survival and victory above parade ground perfection. Thus, the Forgotten Front was never truly forgotten by the institution itself. It was absorbed into the DNA of the British military. The campaigns of 1801 and 1882 were not isolated adventures. They were the dress rehearsals for the massive industrial conflicts that would consume the region in the century to follow. They taught an island nation how to fight on a sea of sand, a lesson that would determine the fate of nations from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Today, if you walk the grounds of Tel el-Kebir or the beaches of Abu Qir Bay, you will find little to suggest that empires once collided there. The desert is a diligent eraser. The wind has long since filled the trenches with drift, and the sun has bleached the bones of the fallen into dust. The iron rails laid by Wolseley's engineers have rusted away or been pulled up, and the shouts of the Highlanders charging at dawn have faded into the silence of history. But while the physical scars on the landscape have healed, the legacy of these campaigns remains indelibly carved into the geopolitical bedrock of our world. The British expeditions into the Ottoman desert were more than just isolated colonial skirmishes. They were the seismic events that raised the mountains of the modern Middle East. Every time we look at a map of the region, We are looking at lines drawn in the shadow of the Redcoats, who first secured the ground. The stability of the Suez Canal, the borders of nations, and the complex relationship between the West and the Arab world all have their roots tangling back to the logistical miracles and bloody struggles of the 19th century. Yet, beyond the grand strategy and the imperial chess games, there is a quieter, more human legacy that deserves remembrance. It is the story of the ordinary men who were asked to do the impossible. It is the story of the private from a rainy English village, standing in a woolen tunic on a scorching dune, fighting not for a canal or a khedive, but for the water in his canteen and the man standing next to him. It is the story of the Indian sepoy crossing an ocean to fight in a land that was as alien to him as it was to his officers. These soldiers proved that human resilience has no fixed limit. They demonstrated that with enough grit, discipline, and ingenuity, an army could survive the most hostile environments on Earth. They battled the sun, the sand, the flies, and the thirst, and in doing so, they expanded the definition of what was militarily possible. They were the pioneers of modern expeditionary warfare, teaching future generations that the greatest weapon in the desert is not the rifle, but the supply chain. History often remembers the generals and the treaties, but it forgets the sweat and the sores. It overlooks the blinding ophthalmia and the crushing heat stroke. By revisiting these forgotten fronts, we do more than just correct the record. We pay a debt of memory to those who marched into the furnace of the Ottoman Empire and forged a path through the fire. Their wars may be forgotten by the masses, eclipsed by the larger conflagrations of the 20th century, but their footprints remain, invisible yet permanent, beneath the shifting sands. In the end, the story of the Redcoats in the desert is a testament to the enduring paradox of the British Empire. A global power built on a fragile web of logistics, held together by the sheer, stubborn refusal of its soldiers to yield to the elements. As the sun sets over the Nile Delta today, casting long shadows over the ancient land, it sets on a world that was irrevocably shaped by the dust and dominion of those unsung campaigns. And there you have it, the grueling, gritty, and game-changing story of the British Army's forgotten desert campaigns. It's a reminder that history isn't just about the famous battles we learn in school. It's about the hidden struggles that shaped the map we know today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Redcoat era, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the tactical brilliance of the night march at Tel el-Kebir outweighs the logistical failures of the earlier campaigns? Let me know your thoughts down below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an episode as we continue to uncover the lost chapters of military history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next front.